This is News Conference Extra with Conan Nolan.
Good morning and welcome to News Conference Extra, a special segment of Today in LA Weekend. I'm Conan Nolan, coming to you from the campus of the University of Southern California, where the Center for the Political Future held a conference in part to look at the 2020 vote, the March 3rd primary in California. Among those taking part, Joe Benenson, who is a strategist and pollster, and Steve McMahon, who is also a strategist for the last Democrat to be elected president of the United States, Barack Obama, who started that campaign in 2008, winning the Iowa caucus. Joel and Steve, thank you very much for doing this. Let's talk first about whether or not you think what we are seeing in Washington right now is going to have an impact on this campaign in November. That is the impeachment of the President of the United States. Some have suggested it's not. People don't vote for impeachment. Others say it will be the red flag that encourages a Democratic turnout in a way you haven't seen before. Steve, weigh in on that.
I actually think the red flag that encourages a Democratic turnout is Donald Trump. The red hair is more likely to turn out the vote than the red flag. The impeachment has sort of driven people to their corners, and they're the corners that most people were already in. I don't know that it's changed a lot of minds. I think Democrats in the House are doing what they feel they're constitutionally obligated to do, and that's what's happening in the Senate, although the Republicans do seem to be interested in a word that they object to, covering up the behavior of Donald Trump. But I think the real turnout motivator for Democrats is going to be Donald Trump and beating him.
Joel?
I think the other challenge it's going to pose for the ultimate Democratic nominee is if this sucks a lot of oxygen up in the media, both the digital media and television media that we're operating in, it may be harder to get your message through as you're running for re-election. And I think if you're not running on something that is impeachment plus, that could be a weakness, not a strength. I think you've got to have something you're saying to the people in addition to impeachment. And if this comes to dominate the campaign and the conversation, I worry it'll dilute the other messages that you need to communicate to win.
Well, you're a pollster. Why are the polls so all over the map in Iowa? Is it that tough a state to poll?
Well, look, I think some people, well, here's the thing. Caucuses are a small number of people vote in them. You can get voter lists, and you know generally who's participated in caucuses before. If you use the typical technique of just randomly calling voters and saying, are you likely to participate in the caucus, your margin of error could go up. You could be getting more people in who may not go on that night. So we tend to do things that rely on lists. We call people who have voted or participated in a primary or caucus. We do screen for people because you could get first-time people in. We did that, and it's why we knew where we were with President Obama, for example, in 2007 and 2008. We knew there was going to be a surge of voters. We knew those voters were committed to showing up. You just have to use every tool available to identify who that likely voter pool is. And I think a lot of that public polling is not as arduous about it as practitioners are. They don't have to win elections. Nobody's measuring them after the fact on whether their polls were right or wrong.
And Steve, it's a completely different animal. For a California voter to tune in and say, well, what is this caucus all about? It's a 3-hour at least commitment. And you go in, and you're sectioned off by who you're supporting or who you're not supporting.
Yeah, it's an interesting process. You go in, you sort of pair up, and you say, okay, the Biden people over here, the Bernie people over here, the Elizabeth Warren people over here, Mayor Pete's people over here, and then they count and figure out what percentage of the vote each of those groups represent. If they're not over 15%, it's like, okay, you're not viable, go somewhere else. And that's why it takes 3 hours. But it's a process that Iowans take very seriously, and you can see the polls moving around, but one of the things you see pretty consistently over the last month is people seem to be coalescing around the candidate that they think is most likely to beat Trump. And right now that's benefiting Joe Biden more than anybody else. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Mayor Pete are right there with him, but he seems to have recovered and seems to be kind of gaining momentum in Iowa.
How much rocket fuel is there in Iowa, in winning Iowa?
Well, look, historically, we haven't had a nominee since 1968 who didn't come in either first or second in Iowa or New Hampshire. I think people underestimate the value of momentum stories. So coming in top 2 is generally pretty important. You know, if you're down in the second tier, if you're down at number 5, it's really hard to recover from that. You need a big performance in the next state, or you're going to get surrounded and, if not drowned, in a very negative narrative about your lack of momentum.
What are you looking for in the results?
Well, I mean, it's a really big moment for Joe Biden. If he's in the top 2, then he's right back to where he was. If he's not, he's going to be climbing back from a position of weakness rather than strength. So I'm sort of looking at the order, and I'm looking for whether or not Joe Biden is in the top 2.
Kamala Harris have a chance to be on the ticket?
I think she'd be a great addition to the ticket.
Does it matter that California is a blue state? It's not going to help the...
Well, here's what I think makes Kamala Harris such a great pick. And I actually said this a year and a half ago on Hardball. I said Joe Biden should say, age is a concern. I'm only going to serve 1 term. I'm picking Kamala Harris because I'm going to help make the first African-American woman president. And I think that would be a great thing for Democratic turnout and enthusiasm. It obviously would be a wonderful thing for Senator Harris, and it would be a great thing for the country.
Here's the downside risk in that from my vantage point. We've only had 11 first-term presidents who ran for a second term and didn't win. I think people see this as a big job. Research I've done with voters think it's really hard for a president to get things done in 1 term. I think the 1-term promise is a weakness, not a strength, even for someone in Vice President Biden's position. The other thing about vice presidential choices I would just tell you is that I don't think anybody's ever won because of who they picked for vice president. I think you can lose. In other words, I think people are ultimately voting for president. I think she'd be a strong pick for anybody on the ticket. But it's not going to tip the balance, I think, in the election. It rarely has.
You think there's going to be a competitive race in California?
No.
It's going to be wrapped up before then.
I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be well on the way to being wrapped up before then. I'm alone. There are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who believe it's going to go all the way to the convention. I'm not one of those people. I think the delegates are going to start to accumulate. The snowball rolling down the hill will get bigger and gain more momentum. And I think that snowball is going to be Joe Biden.
And Joel?
I think it'll be competitive. I think there are enough people with money, if they do okay in the early primaries, you can't not play in Super Tuesday. So I think there are going to be a few people who are going to have enough money to compete. And why get out before Super Tuesday, given that there's such a treasure trove of delegates available on that day? You've got to play in it if you've got money to play.
Joel Benenson, Steve McMahon, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Good luck. NBC4's News Conference program at 9 o'clock is preempted this week by NBC Sports. We will be back next week, and we'll be coming from Des Moines, Iowa, site of the first vote of the 2020 election. I'm Conan Nolan. Have a great Sunday.